The next chapter we're going to cover is all about water. It's hard to talk about life without understanding the importance of water. So when we look at our planet has a huge supply of water on it, and it's one of the reasons that makes Earth so habitable. When you look at the lakes and streams and ponds, and obviously the oceans, roughly 75% of Earth's surface is covered by water, which is why it's called the blue planet and such a hot spot for biological diversity. So when you look at life on other planets, one of the things that they're classically looking for is water. So living organisms are going to require water for temperature regulation, for diffusion and transport, for chemical reactions. So there's a lot of different functions of water that we're going to be hitting over these biology courses. And even our cells, when you look at our cells, they're between 70 to 95% water. So here's planet Earth, and one of the most dominant features you see is the water that's very abundant on our planet. Roughly 75% of the Earth's surface is covered by water. Now, not all that is necessarily usable by, let's say, us, because salt water is something that we have to take special measures for to extract the fresh water out of. But obviously, there's marine organisms that thrive in that salt water. Now, in our last chapter, we talked about bonds. And when you look at water, there's an oxygen, and it's bound to two hydrogen. And that bond that's holding the hydrogen to the oxygen is a covalent bond. But remember, there's two types of covalent bonds. There's polar and there's nonpolar covalent bonds. And remember, with water, if we draw the electrons that are, that bond represents, those electrons are pulled closer to water and away from the hydrogen. So that makes this side of the molecule slightly positive and this side slightly negative. So those types of bonds are polar covalent bonds, which makes water a polar molecule because you have one side that's slightly negative and one side that's slightly positive. And just as a side note, it's not positive and negative on one side, it's just kind of slightly positive and negative. But that polarity allows water to interact with a lot of other polar compounds. And the reason it's so good at reacting with other polar compounds is because when you have the hydrogen to oxygen, so here is the white balls are the H, the red ball is the O, and here's the slightly negative side, and then here's a hydrogen with slightly positive side that creates that hydrogen bond we talked about. And when water interacts with other polar things, it can form these hydrogen bonds. And as I go over the features of water, it's going to come back to the same thing. The reason water has the capability of doing all these things we're going to talk about is because it's a polar molecule and it can form hydrogen bonds. It's all about those hydrogen bonds. So as we talk about water, we're going to go over four major points. We're going to talk about the cohesive behavior of water. We're going to talk about its ability to moderate temperature. We're going to talk about expansion upon freezing. And we're also going to talk about its versatility as a solvent, meaning it can dissolve other things. And these are important properties when we look at life. So let's start with the first one, which is cohesion. So remember, when water molecule is with other water molecules, it's going to form hydrogen bonds. So water molecules forming hydrogen bonds, or you can kind of think of sticking to other water molecules, is called cohesion. So cohesion is the idea of water kind of bonding to water itself. And this is important, especially when you look at plants. And in plants, you have a special type of cells called xylem, and you'll learn this in Bio 102, and they're used to transport water. Well, if a plant takes up water across its roots, how does it get water all the way up through its leaves? Because there's no pump or anything like that. It's all about these hydrogen bonds. Now, another thing water can do is it can stick to other things. So it can form hydrogen bonds to things like ammonia or sugars or even glass and stuff like that. And that's called adhesion. So adhesion is when water hydrogen bonds or sticks to other things. Cohesion is water to water. Adhesion is water to something else. So you have to know the difference between these two terms. So inside of a tree, you're taking water across the roots, up through the stem, and out through the leaves. And it's in these straw-looking things that this happens, and these are xylem. And don't worry about that cell. But inside, here's a water molecule bound to a water molecule, and then to another, and then to another. And that's the idea of cohesion. But you see, water can also bind to the plant cell wall, and when water binds to something else, that's called adhesion. Now, once again, these lines or the dots you see here are just hydrogen bonds, but when water hydrogen bonds to something else, it's adhesion. When water hydrogen bonds to itself, it's called cohesion. Now that cohesion and the ability for water to stick to water can also create surface tension, because on the surface of water, it also interacts with the air. So surface tension is the amount of force it takes to separate those water molecules or simply to break the surface of a liquid. So when you look at an insect like this called a water strider, you can see where its legs touch the water, it's pushing down and creating these indents. However, it's not sinking. It can literally skate around on top of the water because when it displaces its weight out far apart, it doesn't provide enough force to break that surface tension. And once again, this is an important biological phenomenon. But if you've ever seen like whirligig beetles, or in this case, water striders on the surface of water, the reason they can stay up there is because of surface tension. So that's the cohesive idea. The next thing we're going to talk about is the ability to moderate temperature. When you think of water, one of the things that's important to understand is its ability to moderate temperature. So water can absorb large quantities of heat energy, and it can also release that energy back off. And once again, the reason it's able to do this is because of the hydrogen bonds. Now, you guys probably realize when you warm something up, what happens is you have an increase in the kinetic energy. In other words, the molecules move faster. So if you have a solution, and here's the molecules, and you start heating it up, what's going to happen is these molecules move around faster and faster and faster, and they're running into each other. Remember, when you have water, if these are water molecules, they have these hydrogen bonds between them, and that kind of restrains the motion. So when you're adding heat to water, in order to warm it up and make it move faster, you have to first break those hydrogen bonds. And it takes a lot of energy to do that. But when water cools off and it's letting the energy back out, it's going to reform those hydrogen bonds. So in other words, energy in equals energy out. So you can have a huge amount of energy exchange because of water's ability to form these hydrogen bonds, and that allows it to moderate temperature. So kinetic energy is the energy of motion. And when you look at the idea of heat, it's a total amount of kinetic energy due to the movement of the molecules in whatever it is you're looking at. So it's due to the molecular motion. And when you talk about the temperature of something, temperature, I know we think of it as how warm or cold it is outside, but when you're measuring temperature, what's actually being measured is the average kinetic energy of a molecule. So heat is the total kinetic energy, and temperature is the average kinetic energy of something based on the molecules that make it up. So when you have a large volume of water, let's say we had a jug of water this big, and let's say we had a smaller volume of water this big, that smaller volume of water may have a higher temperature. However, the larger volume can have a larger heat. And the reason that this one has a higher heat is because, remember, heat is the total. So there's more molecules in here than there are in here. So even though these molecules might be moving faster, there's more molecules over here. So the average here versus the total here, remember heat is total, would be higher. So heat and temperature, you have to know what they are. Heat is the total kinetic energy, temperature is the average kinetic energy. And just a little bit of background, I'm not going to make you do conversions on the lecture exam, but you will do some of these in lab. So when you talk about science in temperature, you're using the Celsius scale. So it's a measure of temperature in Celsius degrees. So for instance, when you look at boiling, that's going to be 100 degrees Celsius. Freezing is 0 degrees Celsius. Body temperature is 37 degrees Celsius. Now I know we're used to working in Fahrenheit, but if you think of Celsius, it's a much more logical system to use, and scientifically, it's what you have to be aware of. Now another thing is how to measure energy. So energy can be measured in different ways, but one of the ways is by what's called a calorie, an abbreviation is CAL. So it's the amount of energy required to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. That's what a calorie measurement is. How much energy it takes to raise 1 gram of water by 1 degree Celsius. Now, many of you have heard calories before. When you look at a food package, there's 120 calories or 300 calories. What you're actually looking at there are kilocalories. And once again, you don't have to do any conversions, but it's 1,000 times of what a calorie is. Now, another unit of energy is joules. So if you ever see me use joules, realize it's just another energy measurement. And the conversion between joules and calories, 1 joule is 0.239, or 1 calorie is 4.184 joules. Once again, you don't have to know this for the test, just realize calories and joules are units of energy. Now, an important aspect to talk about is what's called the specific heat. The specific heat of a substance is how much heat must be added to raise 1 gram of substance by 1 degree Celsius. So you're measuring energy. So the specific heat of water is 1 calorie per gram per degree Celsius. Now that's kind of interesting. And once again, you don't have to memorize these. But if we look at this chart over here, and this is in joules, so 1 calorie, remember, is 4.184 joules. But that's the specific heat of water. Let's look at ethanol. It's 2.4. Let's look at methane, 2.2. Aluminum, 0.89. What you notice is these things all have a much lower specific heat. Water has a very high specific heat. Why does water have a high specific heat? Because of the hydrogen bonds. When you start adding heat energy, that heat energy is going to make molecules move faster. And remember, kinetic energy, the total is heat. So as the molecules move faster, there's going to be more heat. Water has a high specific heat because first you have to break those hydrogen bonds for the molecules to move faster and faster. Think about it this way. Let's say we had an iron pan, and on that iron, or in that iron pan, you put water. Now you put it on the stove because we want to turn that water into gas. So the way you turn liquid into a gas is heat it up. So if you put that pot on the stove with water inside of it and you turn that heat on, and let's say it's on for 30 seconds, you could put your finger in the water and it probably does not feel much warmer. However, if you touch that iron pan, you would be burned. And that's because the iron heats up very quickly, but the water takes much longer to heat up. Water can absorb and release large quantities of heat energy without actually changing its temperature. And that's because it has a high specific heat, and that's because of hydrogen bonds. So those hydrogen bonds are what has to be broken and reformed as water is gaining and releasing heat. So heat is absorbed when the hydrogen bonds break, and heat's released when hydrogen bonds form. So much of the heat that you're putting into water to make it move faster first goes into breaking those hydrogen bonds. Now, biologically, this is important because water can help balance the temperature inside of organisms or even in different habitats. So high specific heat of water can help prevent temperature fluctuations. So if we look at this as an example, here's California. And you could be in California in the middle of a hot summer day. And if you're in Santa Barbara or Los Angeles or down in San Diego, you're right there on the coastline, and the temperatures roughly stay in that mid 70 region. You can be in San Diego on July 31st, and it'll be roughly 72, 75 degrees. But you go a couple miles inland, and you can see the temperatures can get well over 100. And that's because when you're next to water right on that coastline, you can absorb that heat energy without the overall land and air around it heating up as quickly. And you even see this in our area. If you watch the weather forecast to plan a day to go down to the beach, it'll give you the local forecast, then the shorecast. And you notice that the shorecast, when they talk about, Cape May or Belmar or Ocean City or whatever it is usually about, 10 degrees cooler than what it is inland. And that's because of that ocean, the water, to absorb large quantities of heat energy. Since water can absorb large quantities of heat energy, we can also use it to help cool us off. So there's a process called evaporative cooling. Evaporation is when you turn a liquid into a gas. So how much energy must be added to turn that liquid into a gas is called heat of vaporization. And for water to be converted into gas, there has to be heat applied to it. As that liquid evaporates, it's going to pull the heat out of whatever it's on top of, and that's called evaporative cooling. So when you have water on your skin surface, whether it's sweat or just, hose water, as it evaporates away, you feel cooler. And this is why when we start overheating, we sweat to cool us off. If you think about it, if you've ever put like rubbing alcohol, isopropyl alcohol, on your skin, it feels really cold, right? Well, if you think about it, that bottle of isopropyl alcohol is setting at room temperature. When you put it on your skin, why does it feel cold? Because it evaporates quickly. And when it evaporates, it's pulling that heat energy away, cooling you off. So this is the idea of evaporation. It's taking advantage of water's high specific heat and the ability for water to absorb that heat energy as it's converting from a liquid to a gas. The next thing we can talk about is the ability of water to expand upon freezing. Most things, when you think of freezing or getting cold, they shrink. However, water expands. One of the things you notice about water, when water freezes and turns to ice, that ice will float on top. And that's because the way the hydrogen bonds form between the water molecules, it makes them more ordered. And per unit area, you have less molecules, which lowers their density. So density is looking at how many molecules per unit area. So since ice has less molecules per unit area than what liquid water does, it's less dense and it floats. Now, another thing that you will definitely have to know is this number. Water reaches its peak density at 4 degrees Celsius. So at 4 degrees Celsius, water molecules are the closest they can get together, and that makes them the most dense. So what is the temperature of water at the bottom of the lake in winter? Remember, at the bottom of the lake, it's not frozen. It'll freeze at the top, but since that ice floats, it stays on the top. Down at the water, it reaches 4 degrees because that's where it has its maximum density, and that's the water that sinks to the bottom. What is the temperature of a lake in the middle of summer? It's 4 degrees at the bottom because 4 degrees Celsius is the most dense and that sinks. And another thing we're going to talk about is what's called a turnover. So a turnover is when the top of the water reaches 4 and wants to sink down, but that water down there is then pushed up and it starts mixing around. So I'm going to go over all three of these and I'll illustrate those for you. Now, the importance biologically of ice floating is that if ice formed on the top and it sank, over time that entire body of water would be filled up with ice. So you would have a lake that would freeze all the way to the bottom, and that would make life impossible in that body of water. So since ice floats on the top and then it stays liquid underneath, that makes the fish and the aquatic invertebrates and things like that still have a place to survive over those cold winter months. So here we have a lake in the middle of a cold winter. And what you notice here is at the top it's 0 degrees because at 0 degrees is the temperature that ice freezes and it's less, or water freezes and turns to ice and it's less dense, so it stays on the top. Now you go down and you see it's a little bit warmer, 2 degrees, and then down here it's 4 degrees. So why is it 4 degrees at the bottom? Because that's the peak density of water, and that heavy water sinks down. Now, as you go from winter into spring, what's going to happen is the air temperature warms up, and that means that the water surface is going to start warming up. So from 0 to 1, the ice melts, 1 warms up to 2 to 3 to 4. And what's 4 want to do? It wants to sink, and it's going to push the bottom water up, so that whole body of water will start turning over, and this is called a spring turnover. So a turnover is when that lake begins mixing, and that's biologically important because all the nutrients in lake are at the bottom. So this turnover will bring those nutrients up to the top. So nutrients come up, and the oxygen is up here in the top from the air, and the oxygen goes down. So it mixes the oxygen and nutrients. But then as you continue through spring and the air temperatures continue to warm up, and eventually this reaches 5, 6, it doesn't sink anymore, and it'll start to stratify out. So the turnover stops once that water surface warms up more. Now by summer, you can have a surface upwards of 20 degrees, 22 degrees. But if we look at the bottom, it's still 4 degrees. And once again, the reason why is 4 degrees is when water is the most dense, and that's what's at the bottom. And then as you go from summer into autumn towards winter, the air temperatures cooled off. That 22 is going to drop to 20, 19, 15, 10, 9, 4. When it reaches 4, it wants to sink down, push the water up. There's another turnover. It's called the fall turnover or the autumn turnover. So there's 2 turnovers in the area we live. We live in what's called a temperate environment. You have the spring turnover and the autumn turnover, and that's because the water is uniformly 4 degrees throughout. In the winter, 4 degrees at the bottom, 0 at the top when it freezes, and in the summer, warm at the top, but still 4 degrees at the bottom. And why is it always 4 degrees at the bottom? Because that's the temperature water has its highest density. So if you look at these water molecules, and then between them, these dots once again represent the hydrogen bonds, you notice it locks these together in almost lattice work. And that lattice work compared to liquid water, which is moving, the hydrogen bonds are less organized, so these are closer together. So if you were to look at a unit area, so here's our picture view of the water. And if you start counting 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, so on and so forth, and we count it over here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, you notice there's a lot less. So since they're spaced apart evenly, you can't get as many molecules together. Less molecules, lower density, ice floating. That's why ice floats. It's because of the order of those hydrogen bonds when water freezes. And you also have to know at 4 degrees Celsius, water has its peak density, and that's the water that's going to sink down.